I just want to briefly touch on something quite different and something sort of poetic. This is really, I'm an old third generation Pasadenan, but this is my home. I've spent all my summers here, and you saw, if you looked on those two photographs in my studio, they're both of the rocks of Crystal Cove. How many of you recognize those other than Mike and Carol? And so my real home was the beach and the ocean between Corona del Mar and El Moro, particularly. Since he's here, I have to say that Mike, famous as a lifeguard at Crystal Cove at the time, there were lots of pranks, not just work, lots of pranks, and lots of fun. And one day, we actually swam from Crystal Cove to Emerald Bay. That's quite a feat. We couldn't swim back because the tide was against us, so we had to walk. But anyway, it was quite remarkable. I think most of you here know, some of them were shown, the participants in the Light in Space School. There's Mary Corse is a woman in that. There was another woman who doesn't want to be connected with it anymore, Maria Nordman, who was a terrific artist in the late 60s. But just by way of background, one thing I'd like to say that doesn't often get mentioned, other than the fact that this is not just a phenomenon of the 60s and early 70s, this is an ongoing project that all of us are working on. In the late 60s and 70s, we never, ever thought that these experiments that we made would be of any value or interest to anyone. It's now a worldwide phenomenon, much to all of our surprise. And people are still experimenting. For example, Peter Alexander is doing the best work he's ever done. Very, very exciting work, as is Robert Irwin and Doug Wheeler, James Turrell. But about 50 years ago, this is about a 50-year-old phenomenon, this perception. And before that time, light was always used in the service of something else. For example, light was used to define a figure, a landscape, the light on the leaf of a tree, such as the 18th century English landscape artist, or in the Renaissance to define an arm of a figure on the Sistine ceiling, for example, or in a Raphael Madonna. Light was used in the surface of defining forms. Or in the 19th century illusionists, I think particularly of a beautiful painting that I've been researching at LACMA called Boston Harbor by Fitzhugh Lane, which is about middle 19th century. The Boston Harbor is a scene like the Dutch paintings of the 17th century of the city of Boston, way in the distance, very tiny, and in the foreground, enormous tall ships. It's sunset, and the sun is just going down. And every single thing in the painting is defined by light hitting the sides of the ship, all the pieces of wood, the mast. It's all defined by a single point of light. After this time, when we began experimenting with it, it was strictly a Southern California phenomenon. Light became something in itself. I know that James Turrell is often talking about the thingness of light. And you say, how can it be a thing? It's so elusive. But we began to think of light as the primary, not the secondary. And so the light defined what the forms became. Want to ask you any questions?
Keep going.
You're being too quiet. I want to read to you something that you may think this is very esoteric. It is from a very intellectual writer Kirk Barnadoe, you may know of him, he's no longer with us, he was head of the Museum of Modern Art. And he tried to define the difference between East Coast minimalism and West Coast. And he said this, which I think is very poignant, quote, "In Los Angeles, aesthetic reduction does not lead toward pragmatic concreteness as it does in East Coast minimalism. Instead, it pushes towards dissolution and disembodiment of experience. It is not an optical style, it is an actual optical experience. It points toward uncertainty as opposed to something essential or concrete. West Coast minimalism is all about ambiguity." And I would add to that ambiguity and movement. I had a fascinating conversation with a painter that used to show at the Laguna Art Festival for years. And he did hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of waves that were breaking. And he was trying to capture that pale green just before the wave breaks, which you can only see in the morning, that pale, pale green. And he was so discouraged. He said, "I've tried 50 years to get this damn pale green, and I can't make it happen." I think the problem is it's not capturable. For this reason, you're looking through a body of water, which is reflecting the atmosphere around it. It's also reflecting the sky. It's reflecting the sun. At this time of year in November, the sun is very low in the sky, so you have more of a chance of seeing that partial second of incredible green before the wave breaks. But the wave is always in movement. It never stops. And there are tons of water under it. So it is reflecting the surface of the water. And this is part of what the light and space artists are working for. We're trying, I think all of us, in some way to get the essence of the experience, not the physical object, if that makes any sense to you. The surface sheen on water is always moving. You're capturing the light from above, and you're capturing, if any of you dive, when you dive down, of course, the water is a light green to a dark green. It is not a blue. Here we have terrific storms in Laguna in the winter sometimes. This sky is absolutely an opaque gray, and it looks like steel. It looks like it's impenetrable. The surface light is always totally different than what you see underneath. I particularly am interested in this show today, which has no color in it, but you will see at Peter Blake's. This show is more about fleeting light that you may see from underwater.
Having represented a lot of the light and space artists, whether when you first got started, or all of you first got started, whether it was about light, or whether you were making objects that somehow or another were fascinating to you, and then once it was all kind of examined and light became the cohesive thread through all of it, you realized that it was light.
Yes, I think we all began making objects, and I should add that John McCracken and Craig Kaufman, for example, were more interested in the surface, and not just the nature of cars and the light, the glare in Southern California was a great big part of it. But objects, many of us began with objects, very small ones. And then as you turn them, because it's temporal, it has to do with time, as you turn them, something else would become visible. And I think that then became the moment where the outside shell was no longer of particular interest. Didn't mean we discarded the object. It meant that the interior light that moved and changed and had its being in a different way, and in a more complex way than we had thought before, became manifest.
And we've talked about polyester resin being the material at the time. When you first started to explore the possibility of working without a brush and without canvas, and you started to work with these materials that had never been worked with as artists, what was the reaction from people when you said, you know, I'm working with resin, or I'm pouring plastic, I'm making art?
Well, I was a resin artist at Caltech in 1970, And the scientist said, "Oh, you're going to die. You can't work with that resin. It's poison." It is. It is. And an artist in New York did die from using it. At that time, we were so frightened that we stopped overnight using that material. And many of us are using other materials that are not so toxic. But the materials these were materials that were very, very new. They had been, polyester resin, for example, was a material used during World War II in bombs and other things. It was declassified after the war was over, made its way in some small amounts to craft stores, and all the artists separately, not together, many of us discovered that. 5 or 6 of us were using that for a long time until we found out how dangerous it was and stopped using it.
So to some degree, unlike, say, smoking at that time where you didn't really know how bad it was, did you know from the very beginning that polyester resin was as bad as it was?
No.
Or, okay, so it came on later.
No, I was very careful to wear a very heavy mask and work in a certain area where there were exhaust fans that carried all the, but still it was very dangerous.
We talk a lot about females today and inequality both in the art world and the business world. Without getting into this, because I know we've had this conversation, but how could you as a woman have been working with these materials and been working with the monsters from the light and space, those guys, and here you are, this woman working with these materials that have skull and crossbones on them, and then interacting with guys like those guys. It's impossible for me to imagine as a male that's had to deal with these guys. And my wife came home after working with an artist in San Pedro on pouring resin, and the photos that she was showing me, all I saw were danger, danger, danger. And by the time I was done looking at these photos, I thought, what have I done to promote artists working in this dangerous material? So here we are in 2016, and I'm just really amazed that you were doing this in the 70s, both as a female working with these toxic materials, and to what degree, how you dealt with all of it.
I think the female issue has nothing to do with the materials. We just all found the materials. The materials are very seductive, and the challenge is to try to use them and control them, and not to have them control you. But the other challenge, the boys in Venice, as we call them, are very macho, and no girls were to be a part of their world. We were barely tolerated. I didn't know Mary Corsi at the time, so I felt totally alone. And I commuted every day to Venice at the time because I was working with Jack Brogan, who was teaching me how to polish the surface of these pieces. He worked with all the light and space artists and was brilliant, and is a brilliant technical artist. But it was difficult because no one wanted to pay attention to us. However, between 1969 and 1972, there were literally hundreds of shows here in Chicago and New York and Boston and different places. And I was in many of them, but about 7 or 8 years ago, I had lunch with James Terrell, and he said, "You know, Helen, in the major shows, you were excluded." I said, "Well, I never felt excluded." He said, "Well, that's fine, but you were." However, none of that matters anymore. None of that matters anymore.
We throw the phrase finish fetish around a lot, and I know that Peter Alexander, for example, has threatened to throw me out of the studio a few times because I brought up a flaw in the surface, and he would always scream at me and say, "Nah, don't give me that bullshit now. I'm not interested in your stuff about whatever." But yet you're totally into your finishes and your finishes being perfect. And I know that Jack is the king of the finish fetish. And at what point did you realize that the finish was as important as the light and as important as whatever it was that you were working on perfecting?
That's a really good question. First of all, we were stuck with the term light and space, but the term finish fetish we all rail against. And if we could find the person, the critic probably, who first penned that, he would be finished. But I think I know who it is, but he's dead, so he's done with it anyway. However, how many of you in this room saw the shows connected to Pacific Standard Time that were in La Jolla and San Diego? Oh, lots of you. Okay, terrific. The reason I mention that is because the concept of finish is important to all, whether light and space artists, whether they mention it or not. Because it has nothing to do with finish. It has to do with looking through and looking around and into and beyond objects so that the light becomes disembodied. But if it's housed in a sphere like I would do, or in some wedges that Peter Alexander did, or in a bent acrylic disc that Robert Irwin did, or particularly in scrims that were done by Doug Wheeler, a brilliant artist. In that show in San Diego, Doug Wheeler did an enormous scrim that took up a whole wall. And it was very beautiful. It changed the entire dimension of the room. There was light behind it, and for those of you who saw it, it was very quiet, very contemplative, and very deeply moving. However, if there were a fly crawling on it, all you would see is the fly crawling on it. If something that is highly polished has a scratch, even a hairline scratch, that's all you see. And so whether we like it or not, all of us have been forced into dealing with the finish, the surface of an object, whether it be opaque, transparent, or whatever, whether it be a hard material or a soft material. It's very, very important that it be pristine so that it can lead you and lead your eye and your brain on a path that goes into, through, and beyond the work of art itself. MIT has a huge school of design. MIT is much bigger. And MIT has always paid attention to the visual arts. Caltech has done many tries since the 1930s. It's trying to have art programs. And so one of them had been resuscitated, and I don't remember exactly how Peter Alexander and I and two others came into being. But Caltech had hired a director to direct this program from South Africa. And I don't know how he got here, but he really wanted to be Larry Bell. So he came here, and he worked at JPL and with some of their big equipment because he wanted to do work like Larry Bell. And it never quite happened. He got in lots of trouble and was subsequently deported. So that was kind of a wash. That was not a very good experience. But I did get to know a professor of chemical engineering who was dealing with the theoretical issues of polymers, which make polyester resin. And so it was quite fascinating. You had to kind of seek out things, but the idea was to have these four artists interact with particularly graduate students in chemical engineering in different fields. And the thought was there would be a kind of marriage between art and science, art and engineering, but didn't happen. At the same time, or just afterwards, LA County Museum mounted a show in art and technology, and one of the most, as an aside, one of the most extraordinary pieces to come out of that was a piece by Andy Warhol with rain. And it's just been mounted again. I saw it yesterday in the Pacific Design Center, but now it's digitized. They've had an artist digitize it. It's fabulous. It's a long trek, but I suggest you go take a look at it. But so this art and education, and technology, art and engineering, art and chemistry has always been of interest. And shall I tell them my anecdote about okay. This chemical engineer professor at Caltech said, Helen, would you please come? I have luncheon seminars once a month. Would you please be willing to come and bring some of your small spheres that you were working on to the lunch and bring slides and talk to my group from Caltech and JPL? So I said I would go. There were about 20 gentlemen in a seminar room. We had lunch, and then they put up some slides, and I showed the work. and talked about how they were made from the inside out, how they evolved and developed. All of them are taking the light space and moving it in a much more, I think, in a way, exciting and dynamic direction. Jennifer Steinkamp with her rooms, with the light and the leaves and all the movement. And Eliason is his work is very dramatic. I haven't seen very much of it. I've seen some. I didn't see the big show at the Tate and some of the others, but I've seen lots of reproductions. And it is very, to me, his work particularly is very dramatic, theatrical, and very exciting. I think what it loses is a quality that the light and space artists have, which is one of contemplation and quiet and time.
Yeah, because his the waterfall, I saw that in Brooklyn in '08, and that was amazing. But now all you have is pictures, because you can't experience it anymore.
Yes, and that's a very interesting thing. This work has to be experienced. It has to be about the encounter. The piece that he showed at LACMA of the 12 columns, which many of you have perhaps seen, that was very interesting. I was there from time to time, and I would see the reactions, particularly of kids between about 6 and 12 or 13. I spoke to them. They really got it. You had to bend down and look up and walk around. And the pieces you see today are related to them in a way, but without color. And they do contain a mystery within this envelope of an ellipse. But they are again, unlike these people that are using different means. They are very quiet, and even though they move and change, they are much more contemplative, I would say. I used to work with stained glass when I lived in Boston for a while. That was very interesting. But I wasn't sufficiently excited about pushing through with the technology that it demanded. So no, I'm using an industrial epoxy now with a UV inhibitor in it that is very clear and very exciting. And with each of these things, they're complex. You have to draw upon the knowledge you had before and learn new things. So I'm always dealing with chemists, chemical engineers, people who work with the material, and I'm talking to them, visiting them, observing them, and then going my own way. Anybody? Yes?
Do you necessarily feel that most of your work has to have, and this is not about finish fetish, but a smooth surface? For example, what would happen if there were irregularities, not scratches or things like that, but if it wasn't just flat, but if there were planes or peaks, or the thing that would come to mind would be like a dentos that would Billy Alcott that just stuck holes in it that changed that reflection.
Right. Well, some artists, Billy L., one of them, was interested in the curvature and changes, but he also was interested in how light would be picked up in these curves. I'm more interested in a flat surface and the fact that the human moves around it and it changes. Some discs that I'm working on right now are polished on the back and extremely pristine in the front. They're hand sanded and very rough, but they're still a smooth surface. I don't think it is important or necessary to have movement, but it brings to mind the sky spaces of James Turrell, who has incorporated movement into his light. The light is very controlled. He uses thousands and hundreds of thousands of LED lights in a piece. And have any of you seen any of his sky spaces? Yes, they're remarkable. And he usually has an oculus at the top, either a square or a circle that you look through. And he changes the light. The structure comes to a point, and he changes the light so that your perception of sky is no longer what it was before. The light changes. If the light were static, it would have none of the mystery that his work has. It has to continue to change and move very slowly. I think he is the great one when it comes to the movement of light and pure color. And I'm more interested in the tension between the eye and the brain as one moves around a piece and it becomes something you don't anticipate. I don't work with any dry pigments. I work with liquid. I pour it and mix it, and then I work it on the surface. I do a lot of different things at the moment. In the past, I've done other things. I began by painting, just with oil paint, but I was always interested in the beginning with using very thin washes over each other. And as I say, it brings us all back to these coves right out here where we are today. I mean, this is really has always been my inspiration, and it continues to be. And trying to think of what else to say. This is a very rich heritage. I mean, I can remember, I'm so antique that I can remember being in Laguna during World War II, when everything was rationed. And you could only buy 1 quart of milk, and you had to walk from market to market and hope that you could find a quart of milk. It was quite a different place then, quite interesting. And at Crystal Cove, where I grew up from the age of 3, there were no telephones on the beach. Imagine that, you all have your gizmos with you. No telephones on the whole beach, so if somebody was stuck on the top, a stingray hit the top of the foot, you were doomed. I mean, someone had to take you to the hospital. There was no way to call anyone. And so we kind of lived on the edge of the primitive and the civilized, and it was wonderful.